My name is Fatima and I teach Reading Resource for Struggling Readers. I work with students who are struggling as readers and we design interventions with their teachers to help them improve as readers. And I will also be teaching high school lit. Over the years, research has shown that more than any curriculum or any program, the single thing that improves a child as a reader the most is the teacher. Is the time spent with the teacher, the instruction, the one-on-one instruction given by the teacher, the conversations that the child has about books and reading with the teacher helps a child make the most strides in reading and their levels than anything else that we've seen. In recent years, we are pushing guided reading as educators more and more for the classroom and for interventions. Classrooms that engaged in guided reading saw significant growth in their students during the program. So the average student, not the higher end of the student, but the average student saw 16% of growth the first year, 28% the second year, and 32% by the third year. We also saw that teachers grew as teachers, were better at making more meaningful conversations about books with their students, which allowed them to improve even more. Guided reading is small group instruction. You can have up to 8 students in a guided reading group. Ideally, you want to have up to 4 students in a guided reading group. What a guided reading group allows the teacher to do is it allows the teacher to select texts that are more meaningful and engaging for the student while they are at their level. When a student is reading texts that are far too difficult for them, they might get caught up in decoding and drop comprehension, or if the text they're able to flow accurately but they don't understand, they won't build their comprehension. What guided reading does is it makes sure that the child is reading texts that are at their level that allow them to grow gradually and consistently. And so through guided reading text, children are able to talk about books, get interested in books, consistently read books in school and at home, and this is what pushes their growth along the way. You might wonder, how do I start with guided reading? The first thing is to make sure that your classroom has a structure where you're able to flow and you're able to work with small groups one at a time. Guided reading does not work with a large group where you're giving instruction to the entire class. For something like that, you want to refer to close reading. For guided reading, you need smaller groups. The most important thing before we even start talking about guided reading is to establish the secret to success, which is to establish clear routines and expectations for your students so they understand the flow of the classroom, they understand which groups they're working in and how their groups will flow. They understand what part of the classroom they will be learning in and how the groups can function without the teacher managing them the entire time. Now, people have used different methods to do this. We're going to go through the steps of establishing guided reading in your classroom. The first step is to read your assessments. Collect the assessments that your school uses for reading. Many schools use the MAPS, the IWAs, they might have other independent programs to use to assess reading. If you do not have a formal assessment program in your school, this is something to talk to your administrator about. It is definitely worth investing in. If the school is not ready to invest in something like this, there are many cost-efficient programs that you can access online for yourself. For example, MobiMax, you can use Reading A to Z, or you can purchase programs like Fontes and Pinnell that come with formal assessments that the teacher would conduct one-on-one with the student. Reading assessments are extremely important, but they are not the be-all and end-all. Sometimes a child might not score that well in assessment because of how they're feeling. They might get nervous and jittery with assessments. This is why assessments need to be repeated throughout the year. This is why a child's reading needs to be monitored throughout the year. So the first step would be to read your assessments and start grouping your students. But keep in mind that the student might not stay in this group the entire year. They might grow quicker than the other students and move on to the next level, or they might not have scored accurately and you'd have to reassess. But this will be identified when you're working with a student in smaller groups. After you've grouped the students, you need to identify a structure for your classroom that works for a flow of groups. Again, we said we can refer to the Daily 5 or other methods, but basically what that means is that when one group is working on one task, the other group is independently working on another. How would that look in a classroom? For example, one group might be working on word work and they're working on their vocabulary words, or they're journaling on a writing prompt that the teacher assigned. The other group is sitting with the teacher working in a guided reading group. Depending on the size of your classroom, let's say if you have 24 students, you might have 6 groups in your class. That might be too many for you to manage if you don't have a paraprofessional. So you might have 3 reading groups. If you spend time in the beginning of the school year establishing routines of how we flow from group to group and task to task, guided reading will become doable because you will have time for it every day. And you will also have a structure in place where students will look forward to the different activities within reading. If you have a paraprofessional, make sure that you are utilizing your paraprofessional to assist with instruction during this time. So we've talked about reading assessments and grouping our students. We've talked about establishing a structure for guided reading. The next step would be to keep up with your assessments. So once at the end of every quarter or semester, if you have more support in your classroom and more individuals to help with testing, then you can test twice a quarter. But basically, testing a student would be to sit down and have the student read with you, and you're using some sort of assessment tool where you're marking the child's mistakes or where they're struggling, and based on that you identify where to place your students, monitor the amount of growth they've made over the time that you've taught them. One of the programs that I use that I found very easy to use is Fountas and Pinnell. For assessments. Our school also used the MAPS, and that was something that we used both of those assessments simultaneously, because one assessment was done with the child testing on their own on a computer, which is okay as well. But the Fountas and Pinnell assessment allowed me to connect with the student, hear them as a reader, and understand them more as a reader, allow them to talk about the book, which a computerized assessment will not allow you to do. So bear that in mind. And as you go, you want to modify your students' groups and where you're going to place them. So one of the things to keep in mind is that make sure that students are placed accurately. That's key. The second thing is that before you move them on to another level or behind, make sure that you have done a formal assessment to make sure that that is the right choice for the child. And make sure that you are also watching comprehension as well as fluency in reading. Sometimes a child may struggle at a reading level for fluency, but they will understand comprehension. So you want to make sure that the child is efficient in both skills before you move them on to the next level. Here's an example, if you look at this assessment page, of how you can identify grouping for your students. So in the first column, you see the reading A to Z levels, which is a different reading program. You see the ages of the children and their grade level. The second column shows their equivalent in Fountas and Pinnell. These charts and diagrams are very helpful to place your students accurately. If you're using a formal assessments through the state or through your district or through school-wide assessments, you need to do a little bit of research to identify where your students need to place according to the assessments you used and how they correlate to the reading program that you are using for instruction. This is extremely important. And if you look at the second chart, there are, in addition of other programs, for example, we have Lexiles according to MAPS, then we have RazKids. So online, there are many charts like this that are accessible where companies have formulated these charts for us to understand where to place our students to make the assessments more applicable to the reading materials we are using for instruction. Okay, so we have gone through the steps of guided reading. We've placed our students, we've grouped them, we're monitoring their progress. Let's talk about instruction. During the instruction of guided reading, the teacher engages the students with the books. So for the younger grades, what you might do is do a book walk. You talk about the book, you talk about the cover, the back of the cover. You have students ask students questions like, what do you think this book is about? What type of genre do you think the book is? You get them to start thinking about the book and talking about the book. For older students, you can still do a book walk, but your questions might be more in depth. You might ask about the genre, you might ask about their schema, their prior knowledge to connect them to the topic or the theme of the book. So, for example, if I was reading Esperanza Rising with my students, which is a historical fiction novel that takes place in Mexico and the United States, I would ask students about their familiarity about immigration and immigration from Mexico to the United States, or if they're familiar with the two countries, what they know about it, what they know about the culture, do they know what language they speak. All these things get the students to start thinking about the book. During your guided reading discussion circles, you want to ask more meaningful questions to your students. For example, what do you think the character is feeling right now? What do you think such and such character would do in such situation? You can ask questions like, what is happening in the story? Who are the main characters? Why do you feel that this person is the main character? These are questions that get students to think about the book and reflect about the text that they're reading. For nonfiction, guided reading text can also include nonfiction. It is an excellent option to alternate between fiction and nonfiction text through guided reading, especially on topics that engage students that they take interest in. In conclusion, something to keep in mind about guided reading is that it's a process. It's not something that's going to be easy to implement 100%. Work towards it gradually. If you want to break your students up into groups, it's okay to start with just 2 groups and gradually move on to 3 and 4 and differentiate according to student levels. It's okay to take your time to ease into it, especially when you're teaching routines. If you're establishing stations for your students to work in, like where they will be rotating, but take your time to teach routines and transitions to your students before you dive into guided reading. It will be extremely helpful. And one of the things you might be wondering is, how often should I see my students for guided reading? Your more advanced readers and at-level readers, you can see less. You want to see the struggling readers as much as possible throughout the week. So for example, you might want to read with a struggling reader in a guided reading group with you or a paraprofessional at least 4 times a week. A more advanced reader, once a week would be sufficient. So I hope this helps you to implement guided reading in your classrooms. Good luck.